In this video, we're going to go over some debugging tips for when things go wrong in your code, and they inevitably do. I'm just going to go over a list of some strategies and best practices, and then I'm going to show you the page inspector in Chrome anyway. And there's a similar thing in any browser. You may have to investigate it if you're using another browser besides Chrome, but I'll show you what it does, and then that'll give you the idea. You should be able to figure it out on your own in your own browser if you use something different. But first of all, let's just talk conceptually. And I've illustrated this in the other videos in the class, but if you're coming to this video early on because you are having some trouble with some of your code, I'll try to be explicit about what I mean about each of these suggestions. So first of all, test your code often. You don't want to write too much code before testing, because then if something does go wrong, it's harder to identify exactly where it's going wrong. So even if you're really, really sure that you know exactly what you're doing, stop and test your code often, usually after each, say, logical structure. You might want to do a test to make sure that it's working properly. After each function, you might want to make sure it's working properly. And of course, if it's a larger function, you might want to break that down into the individual steps. So test that code often. It helps you identify where problems occur. When you do have problems, one really easy strategy you can do is if things were working and now suddenly they're not, comment out the lines that you just wrote and then slowly reintroduce each line until you can figure out exactly where the problem lies. Now, you may have to be a little bit careful about this, right? So if you comment out an entire, say, for structure that you created, when you bring it back, you'll have to bring it back, the first for line plus its ending bracket, or you'll just be introducing another error. So you have to do it strategically, but commenting out new lines, especially if suddenly they cause the program to stop working, can help you identify exactly where issues are. And then, of course, once you've identified the line, usually it's a syntax error. Sometimes you'll have some other kind of error, like a mistype error in a variable, using a string variable to do numeric calculations, something like that. But check your syntax. There are a lot of tricky little things with punctuation in JavaScript. It's used in some different ways in different contexts, so just make sure you're aware and that you've got all of your punctuation correct and your spelling. Remember, JavaScript is case sensitive, so you have to be aware of capital letters and lowercase letters in certain of the commands and preset features that you use. But you do want to track intermediate values of variables. So if something's going wrong, like let's say you're getting an undefined value for something that you feel like should have definitely been defined, that would be a great time to use some method of tracking what the value of a variable is before you're getting that final outcome, to see exactly where the calculation is going wrong. And again, I'll illustrate this also with the page inspector in just a second. And then finally, when you're learning new skills, and especially if it's something a little more complicated, or if you have an algorithm that's really key to what you're doing and you want to make sure it's going to work right, practice these small parts in standalone files before integrating them into a complex program. And again, I illustrated this particularly in modules 5 and 6 as we're working on that larger scenario program that we've done through the class. I took individual little pieces that we wanted to introduce and worked on those in their own file, made sure I had the logic working correctly before going to the big program and integrating that in. So that can be really helpful and keep you from spinning your wheels, because again, in those longer programs, there could be lots and lots of things that go wrong, especially when you introduce new parts of code. So you want to make sure that piece is working right, and then you can look at other things if it's still not working. So that gives you a sense of just some advice about how to go about dealing with code that doesn't work. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the page inspector that has some tools just to help make some of these things easier, and particularly that idea of tracking those intermediate values of variables. So here we are at our Card Wars program that we created. And all I did here is right click, and I'm just going to hit, and we've done view page source. I'm just going to hit the inspector here. And we looked at this in the HTML classes as well. And this was the view that we looked at, and we saw how you could look at individual elements and check out which CSS code was being applied to a certain element, right? And it shows all the different CSS that's being applied, that sort of thing. But you can also use console here specifically to look at your script and to do some things that are really helpful, in particular to watch variables and to add breakpoints that are basically going to be places where the program is going to pause and check what values are. Okay, so those are the two main things that I want to illustrate here. And as you can see, I did already set one, but I'll show you exactly how to do it. So let me just show you the function for just a second. So when I actually cause the program to function, it's going to stop here at this breakpoint, and then it's going to tell me the value of the variables that I was watching. Now, I could watch additional variables. The way that you do this is just hit the plus sign under the watch and then put in the name of the variable feature that you want to watch. So here I'm going to add spades length, and as you can see, it's going to report that out in real time for me. Notice down here, it's keeping track. It's telling me that it was number of decks 3, which in fact it was. The index val, which is one of the variables that I'm watching, is at 0. I'm also watching check game up here. That one's at nothing. That one's going to be nothing for a long time because that's the one that tells us when the game is over. Now, you see what it did? It stopped here at this breakpoint, and then it gave me this little message here that is paused in debugger. And if I wanted to keep going, I can go ahead and tell it to do that. And notice it's pausing each time, and each time it's pausing, it's actually it's incrementing the value. So I can dynamically watch, and I can just use this to it's called step through my code, and I can watch the value of the variables changing as it continues to step through. So if I want to clear the breakpoint, I just click on it like that, and then it will go ahead and run like usual. And let's say I want to introduce a different breakpoint here. You just do that by clicking on these actual line numbers. When I click, it's gonna, when it does go through. So if I don't get a spade, I'm not gonna hit this breakpoint, right? And so it is still watching my variables for me, but it's until I draw a spade, it's not gonna hit that breakpoint. So here we hit a spade. And why would I do that? That would be, let's say I was having a problem with the spades and getting some undefined values or something, and I want to specifically watch those, then maybe that's when I would want to check if I come here. But think how useful this is. If you write some logic and you're not sure, is it really getting into my my if statement? Is that if statement really doing what I want it to do? You can set a breakpoint there and see what things are looking like and see if it's actually getting to that part of your program. That's a really helpful, useful part too. And notice here, it did stop at the breakpoint. It reported out the different values of the variables. This one says not available because we're in a different function. And remember we talked about local variables. So index val is a variable that's not in this function. So it can't tell me what that value is. So you can see how that functions to show you the values, allow you to stop your program at specific points to test if your logic is working, or just to gather some data at that point. So you can use breakpoints to do that. And then of course you can add watches for your variables. And of course it's real nice that it shows you your code here. So that's very helpful. Now, in order to launch this, I will note the first time I used this, I did have to use Control P in order to actually open the page here in this sources pane. So you may have to do that, but once you've done that, it is a pretty useful tool. It can prevent you from having to put all those alert statements in your code that we were using to watch our variables, and you can watch them in this way. And it gives you some other tools as well to help you with your debugging. So that just gives you a few tips about debugging with programming language. It's a little bit different than debugging with a markup language like HTML or CSS, because there's a lot more things that can go wrong, quite frankly, just because it's just a more complex type of programming.